In 1759, the British Army was fighting 5 wars at the same time on 5 different continents. And guess what? They were winning. How did a relatively small island army end up becoming one of the most dominant land forces in global history, and then nearly vanish into irrelevance multiple times? Buckle up. This is the complete history of the British Army, packed with shocking decisions, ruthless ambition, and one astonishing comeback after another. And by the end, you'll understand how a red-coated force, marching in straight lines, became the high-tech, rapid deployment army we see today. Oh, and we'll answer one burning question. What happens when an empire builds an army and the empire collapses? Welcome back to the war. Before England had a standing army, it relied on pretty much anyone with a weapon. Medieval kings raised armies when they needed them and disbanded them after the war. It was chaos. In 1066, William the Conqueror brought over a well-organised Norman force, but by 1215 the barons were literally forcing the king to sign the Magna Carta because no one trusted armies anymore. Then came the War of the Roses, where Englishmen slaughtered Englishmen in an endless power struggle. If you think modern politics are messy, imagine 30 years of backstabbing, betrayals and beheadings. But here's the real twist. England didn't even have a proper national army until after it executed its own king in 1649. After that, Oliver Cromwell created the new model army, professional, trained, disciplined and terrifying. These guys weren't just soldiers, they were religious zealots with muskets. But it all came crashing down with Cromwell's death. The army lost its direction, and Britain said thanks, but no thanks, and brought back the monarchy in 1660. And now came something revolutionary, a permanent army loyal to the crown. The British Army was born. But here's a question for you. How do you create a loyal national army when most of your citizens are terrified it'll be used against them? Stick around, because in chapter 2, that fear nearly destroys the army from within. Drop a comment. Do you think standing armies should have more power or less? From 1660 to the early 1800s, the British Army was defined by its bright red uniform and global ambition. This is the age of empire. The army fought in Europe, Africa, Asia and the Americas. It helped conquer India, crushed uprisings in Ireland and faced off against France in the 7 Years' War, which Winston Churchill later called the First World War. But there was a catch. Most of the army's officers weren't promoted by merit. They bought their commissions. Literally. You could pay to be a captain, a colonel, whatever you could afford. Sounds crazy, right? Well, imagine being led into battle by someone whose only qualification was a rich father. Which brings us to America. In 1775, the British Army marched confidently into the American colonies and got absolutely humiliated. Why? Because while the British were marching in perfect formation, the American rebels hid behind trees and fired from cover. It was the beginning of the painful truth. The British Army was built for European wars, not guerrilla fighting. And yet, less than 40 years later, the army pulled off its greatest ever victory. Waterloo, 1815, the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon defeated. It was the climax of the redcoat era, but even victory couldn't stop the coming storm. And here's a twist. After Waterloo, Britain becomes the most powerful empire in the world, and the army, it gets neglected. Why? Because the Royal Navy gets all the glory. But that's where things go horribly wrong. And if you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to like and drop a comment. What's the most underrated battle the British Army ever fought? We'd love to hear your thoughts and could do a video on it at a later date. Post Waterloo, the British Army became more of an imperial police force. From Afghanistan to Africa, they fought dozens of colonial campaigns, some successful, some disastrous. But then came a harsh wake-up call. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. The British Army went in with outdated tactics, poor logistics, and officers who were more aristocrat than strategist. Result? Tens of thousands of avoidable deaths, and the birth of modern war journalism. People back home were horrified. Enter Florence Nightingale, reformer of battlefield medicine. The British Army realised it had to modernise or die. But it got worse. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, showed the world just how vulnerable the British Army really was. It took 3 years and 400,000 troops to defeat just 60,000 Boer fighters. Again, guerrilla tactics, the same kind that crushed them in America. But here's the twist. By 1914, the British Army had learned. It was small but professional, highly trained, battle-tested. And when the First World War broke out, it went in first and paid the price. In 1914, the British Expeditionary Force was called the Old Contemptibles. They held the line against the Germans in Belgium, but by Christmas, most of them were dead or wounded. What followed was industrial slaughter. The Somme, Passchendaele. The army suffered over 700,000 deaths in World War I, which came to an end in 1919, which resulted in the victory for the Allies. That trauma shaped a generation, and when the next war came, the army was completely unprepared. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, but within months, the British Army had been driven off the continent. Dunkirk, a miracle evacuation, but a humiliating defeat. It wasn't until 1942 to 1945 that the army recovered, pushing through northern Africa, Italy, and finally helping to liberate Europe. But the war left Britain bankrupt, the empire dying, and the army about to reshape for the modern world. And now, a short break to check out our merch and membership programs. Now, back to the action. Post World War II, the British Army transformed from an imperial force into a modern fighting machine. But it wasn't easy. First came the end of empire, India, Palestine, Africa. The army was constantly fighting to manage Britain's retreat from global dominance. Then came a new kind of war, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, an internal conflict, urban, political, brutal. And during the Cold War, the British Army of the Rhine sat in Germany ready to face off against the Soviet Union. They never fired a shot in Europe, but were constantly deployed to hotspots across the globe. And in 1982, the army proved it could still punch far above its weight in the Falklands War. 10,000 miles from home, harsh terrain, Argentine bombs falling. Yet British troops landed, advanced, and won in less than 3 months. But then came 1991, the Gulf War. A new age of warfare was dawning. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the army entered its most complex missions yet: counterinsurgency, nation building, and asymmetrical warfare. These weren't wars of conquest, they were wars of confusion. British troops fought bravely, but faced unclear objectives, political constraints, and shifting enemy tactics. At home, public trust wavered, budget cuts slashed personnel, and the army shrank to its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars. Yet British forces earned international respect for their skill, professionalism, and adaptability, whether in peacekeeping missions, special operations, or cyber defence. And today, the British Army is smaller, leaner, but smarter. More joint operations, more tech, more rapid response. But there's still one big question left unanswered. Remember our question from the start. What happens when an empire builds an army and the empire collapses? The answer? The army doesn't disappear. It evolves. The British Army was forged in monarchy, tested in empire, and refined in modern warfare. But it's not perfect. It never was. But it's still standing, still serving, still adapting. And its story isn't over. So what do you think? Can the British Army remain relevant in a world of drones, AI and cyber warfare? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more gripping stories of British military history, check out our playlist on the British Army. And also let us know in the comments what other battles or wars the British Army has fought in that you would like to see covered in more detail. Hi soldiers, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and check out our merch and membership programs. And don't forget to check back in again soon. That's an order.